Maduro is the latest example. We know we had an election last year where he lost. It's proven, we have the ballots, etc., and yet he maintains power. Unfortunately, with a lot of these dictators, the one thing that needs to happen is force. I don't think Brazil's there. I don't think Colombia's there because, again, Colombia is also in that orbit, but we're hoping for the best.
Well, Congressman Gimenez, first of all, such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure.
I'd like to start with the press you had yesterday with Representative Diaz-Balart and Representative Salazar on the information per the Ukrainian intelligence that we have Cuban troops fighting for Russia in Ukraine. What do we know so far and how consequential do you think it is?
Well, what we know so far is that Ukrainians believe there's about 20,000, at least 20,000 Cuban troops fighting for the Russians in Ukraine. They're being given about $2,000 a month. We don't know if actually that money gets to the fighters themselves. We also don't know if the fighters know, when they're being recruited in Cuba, what it is that they're being recruited for. They've been offered Russian citizenship, all kinds of promises, and then they end up going to Russia, and the next thing you know, they're on the front lines of the Ukrainian war. And the Ukrainians believe that the average lifespan, the duration is you live about 120 to 170 days before you get killed because they're used as cannon fodder, the same thing they do with the North Koreans. And so North Koreans make up a larger number. Cubans are the second largest foreign fighters fighting for Russia now against Ukraine.
Well, we're just mentioning Russian influence on Cuba, and of course, that's not the only concern with Cuba. When we talk security, there's of course Chinese influence, Iranian influence, and now we have for the first time a Latino Secretary of State, and attention is being brought to the region in foreign policy, like maybe it hasn't been in decades. How big of a development is that, and what steps could be taken security-wise with the Cuban regime?
Well, it's huge that we have Marco Rubio as a Secretary of State. I think he's also the National Security Advisor, so he's got two roles, very important roles, obviously in the president's ear on a daily basis. Former Senator Marco Rubio understands the Western Hemisphere, the region, the geopolitical implications of what's happening with Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. And so I would expect that we take a little bit more aggressive stance. I think you've seen that with the actions that the president has taken so far, especially against Venezuela. As far as the Cuban regime is concerned, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and now Mexico is actually giving support and help to the regime in terms of economic assistance, and in the case of Venezuela and Mexico, actually supplying them with oil that they need in order to keep the lights on. It's hard for the Cuban regime to keep the lights on right now. The infrastructure is falling apart, the economy is falling apart, and we see the regime is probably in the weakest position it's been in a long time. That's why we think also that those 20,000 that are over in Ukraine, we don't know if those fighters, those soldiers, those volunteers are actually getting that money, $2,000 a week. I think it could be very close to what happens with the doctors that the Cubans contract around the world, where actually the regime keeps about 80 to 90% of the money, and the doctors themselves are doing the work. Maybe you get 10%. It's akin to modern day slavery.
You've called what was happening with the doctors modern day slavery on social media recently when in August, Secretary Marco Rubio unveiled sanctions and visa restrictions on Brazilian officials because it was probably, I'm a native Brazilian, so that was a big story, of course. And it's estimated that up to $1 to $2 billion could have been funneled into Havana based on that in Brazil. Yes. So how big is it for the Cuban regime to export labor like that, what you have called modern day slavery, and what other steps could be taken to stop that? How big is it of a blow to the Cuban regime that sanctions like this are happening?
The problem with some of the sanctions is the United States can put sanctions in them, but if our allies don't follow suit, like in the case of Europe, we know that there are 20,000 Cubans fighting for Russia. Our European allies are helping Ukraine against Russia, and yet they continue to do business. They don't do the sanctions against Cuba. And so, part of yesterday's news conference says, hey, the Ukrainians are now going to push for these sanctions against Cuba at the European Parliament and the NATO nations, etc. Because frankly, Europe is kind of schizophrenic in that case. They're on the one hand helping Ukraine, but then on the other hand, some of them are still buying Russian oil, Russian energy, and are not taking the steps necessary in order really to put the squeeze on Cuba, North Korea, Iran, and even China. China is now is helping Russia tremendously in that effort against Ukraine. So we're going to be serious. Let's be serious, all right, and help our the great Ukrainian people are fighting for their freedom. Here in the United States, here in the Western Hemisphere, we have supposedly some allied nations that are really still helping Cuba. Mexico comes to mind. Why is Mexico shipping over 30,000 barrels of oil to Cuba? What are they getting in return from Cuba for them shipping that oil? I think it's all got to do with ideology. The Mexican government is very, very leftist, very much aligned with the Cuban government, and is giving them a helping hand. And the Mexican government is helping with the oppression and the suppression of the Cuban people and denying them democracy and freedom.
When we talk about Mexico and the Morena Party, they have historically been very close to the Cuban dictatorship. But when we talk about getting the squeeze on, like you mentioned, if you go further and down south to Brazil, recently we've also seen a great amount of pressure on the current administration in Brazil. So currently we have a 301 investigation on commercial practices on censorship on social media. Justice Alexandre de Moraes has been sanctioned under the Global Magnitsky Act for what President Trump has called a witch hunt on former President Jair Bolsonaro. Yeah. Is it the perception among Republicans in the US that Brazil is going into a point of authoritarianism? What is right now the perception on the other largest democracy on the hemisphere?
Look, the president of Brazil is a far leftist. I'm not going to deny that. And so, but do we think it's going that way at this point? I think Brazil has strong democratic institutions and has survived him before, and will probably survive him again. But there's no doubt that these regimes are looking for a way to maintain power, maybe not in a democratic fashion, using democracy against democracy, and then we got to watch out for that. Look what happened in Venezuela. Chavez was elected democratically, and then he dismantled, all of the safeguards for true democracy, and then stayed in power under the guise of democracy. But was it really democracy? And so Maduro is the latest example. We know we had an election last year where he lost. It's proven. We have the ballots, etc., and yet he maintains power. Unfortunately, with a lot of these dictators, the one thing that needs to happen is force. I don't think Brazil's there. I don't think Colombia's there, because again, Colombia is also in that orbit. But we're hoping for the best. But again, all of these countries that are aligned ideologically, are helping each other. And the head of that snake is Cuba, without a doubt. They're the ones that foment all that kind of revolution, and helps these other like-minded governments stay in power.
Because you touched on Venezuela, I want us also to go through the use of military force currently in the Caribbean against narco-terrorist organizations, because when we talk about the Cartel de los Soles, the government cartel of Venezuela, that essentially involves also the Venezuelan regime. Yes. So what's your reaction to the increased use of force recently against the boats in the Caribbean and the increased deployment of troops in Puerto Rico? Is it possible that we could have regime change based on that in Venezuela?
Well, I don't know. I know there's plenty of resources there now in the Southern Caribbean. President Trump has all the options at his fingertips. We have placed a $50 million bounty on the capture of Nicolas Maduro. We have identified him as the leader of the Cartel de los Soles. we have also designated that cartel as a narco-terrorist organization. And why are we doing what we're doing? Well, we're doing what we're doing because those cartels, along with the Mexican cartels at the border, have killed over 500,000 Americans in the last 5 years. That's more than when we lost in the entire World War II. That's more than 10 times what we lost in the Vietnam War. And so these cartels have been waging war on us, killing us, and we haven't done anything about it. Well, you declared war on us, obviously, because you killed 500,000 of us. This president is not going to stand for it. And so if you're trying to import your poison into the United States to kill Americans, then you will suffer the consequences. It's not, people say, well, it's a law enforcement action. No, it's not a law enforcement action. It's whether you get killed by a bullet or you get killed by fentanyl, all right? It's poison. You're dead. And so, even a couple of years ago, more than a couple of years ago, I asked then FBI Director Wray, why aren't they being labeled as terrorists? They're killing us. Well, because legality. No, they're killing us. And they were killing 200 to 300 Americans every single day. So can you imagine if you had a terrorist group cross the border, go into a mall, kill 300 people, and then go back to the border? How many days would we stand for that? Well, we were tolerating that for years. The President Trump's not going to tolerate that. So those folks that are transporting drugs know that it's not simply, we may not just, stop you, interdict you, you may actually lose your life if you're trying to transport those poisons that are going to kill us into the United States.
Now, we're talking just days before Charlie Kirk's funeral, and I want to shift at that just because it's such a major event that has impacted, I think, not only the United States, but the world more broadly. So your reflection on his life and legacy, also for the Latino community, and what does this mean for the U.S. in terms of political violence and free speech?
Well, Charlie was about free speech and the freedom of expression, but Charlie was also about debate. Our founding fathers felt that it was vital that we have freedom of speech and that we have a rigorous, emotional, passionate, debate between people. But the argument was going to be settled not by violence, but at the ballot box. And Charlie tried to bring that. And if you actually look at what he was doing on campuses, he would invite those that had opposing points of view to come to the mic first, so that he can have a debate. And I never saw any where he was ever disrespectful. It was a debate, on ideas, and I think that he was reaching a lot of young people. To be honest with you, I really didn't know how popular he was until this tragedy. One of my granddaughters, 8th grade, told me that, or told her father, said, hey, I really wanted to see him. If you come to the University of Miami, I wanted to see him, and so did my friends. You wanted to see Charlie Kirk, really? And my other granddaughter, who's a junior in high school, said that there was a whole bunch of her classmates were also, fans of Charlie Kirk. And then you see around the world, this phenomenon, that Charlie Kirk was. A very important voice was silenced, or so that person thinks. But actually, I think what they did is just now more and more people are actually looking, okay, what was he about, and starting to see what he was about. Just like with Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, they may not be here, but their voices are still heard. I think Charlie Kirk's voice is going to be heard, not only with what he stood for and recordings of what he did, but also his wife, I think, is dedicated to carry on that mission. And then all those turning point chapters around the nation, they know that they have to carry the banner now. And so I actually think that it's going to be more people are going to listen to Charlie Kirk's voice now than before. As far as political violence is concerned, there's no place for political violence. Left, right, middle, doesn't matter. And so we got to get to a point where we're back to what our founding fathers wanted, which was rigorous, passionate, emotional debate. But after it's said and done, the winner's determined at the ballot box, and then, let's go have a cup of coffee. Okay.
Oh, Congressman Gimenez, it's been a pleasure.
Pleasure's mine.